Experience the intimate world of Marie Antoinette, the last bath, where every moment holds the weight of unspoken understanding. In this peaceful journey through time, you'll discover the quiet dignity of people living their daily lives, unaware of how their small gestures reveal the depths of human experience. The morning light at Versailles moved with the deliberate pace of ceremony itself, filtering through the tall windows of Marie Antoinette's bedchamber in shafts that seemed to understand their role in the daily transformation of woman into queen. The pale October sun cast geometric patterns across the Aubusson carpets, each beam carrying within it the weight of autumn and the promise of a day that would unfold according to rules older than memory. In this light, everything took on the quality of ritual, from the way shadows fell across the gilt furniture to the manner in which dust motes danced in the air, like tiny courtiers attending their sovereign. She stood in the center of this carefully orchestrated morning, her body held in the particular stillness that years of ceremony had taught her. Around her, the ladies in waiting moved with the precision of dancers who had performed this same choreography countless times, their silk slippers whispering against the polished floor as they approached and withdrew, each carrying some essential element of the queen's daily armor. The rustle of their skirts created a continuous gentle symphony, punctuated only by the soft clink of jewelry being arranged on silver trays and the almost inaudible consultation of voices that knew their place in this ancient hierarchy. The chemise they lifted over her head was so fine it seemed to be woven from morning mist itself, the silk catching the light and releasing it in ways that made her skin appear luminous. She felt the fabric settle against her shoulders, the weight of it both substantial and ethereal, a reminder that even her most intimate garments were part of the elaborate fiction that transformed Marie Antoinette, the woman, into Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France. Each thread had been chosen, each measurement calculated, each fold designed to present a version of femininity that served the crown as much as it served the woman who wore it. The Duchesse de Polignac approached with the stays, and Marie Antoinette lifted her arms in the gesture she had performed thousands of times, her body knowing its role in this daily resurrection. The Duchess's hands were gentle but certain as she positioned the stays, understanding that this moment required both intimacy and distance, the particular alchemy that allowed one woman to dress another who happened to be the most powerful woman in France. The stays drew tight with a whisper of silk cord through metal eyelets, creating the silhouette that would carry the weight of state throughout the day. In the mirrors that lined the chamber, Marie Antoinette could see infinite versions of herself being created, each reflection revealing a different angle of the transformation. There was something hypnotic about watching her own multiplication, the way the mirrors caught not just her image, but the movement of the ladies around her, the play of light across silk and skin, the careful arrangement of objects that would adorn her body. She existed in this moment between sleep and sovereignty, neither fully private nor entirely public, suspended in the space where the personal self dissolved into the requirements of the crown. The morning air in the chamber carried the scent of rose water and powder, fragrances that had been chosen not for her personal preference, but for their appropriateness to a queen's toilette. These were the smells of ceremony, of tradition, of the careful maintenance of an image that belonged as much to France as it did to the woman who inhabited it. The warmth from the fireplace created gentle currents in the air, stirring the heavy curtains and causing the flames of the candles to dance even in daylight, their light adding warmth to the cooler tones of the morning sun. Madame Campan approached with the first of the day's gowns, a creation of pale blue silk that seemed to hold within its folds all the colors of a spring sky. The fabric moved like water as it was lifted, catching light and shadow in ways that made it appear almost alive. Marie Antoinette extended her arms again, allowing the gown to be settled over the foundation garments, feeling the weight of it as it fell into place around her body. Each layer added not just physical weight, but symbolic weight, the accumulation of silk and jewels and ceremony that would carry her through another day of being perpetually observed. The process of dressing continued with the methodical precision of a religious service, each element added in its proper sequence, each gesture performed according to rules that had been established long before she was born. The ladies moved around her like planets in their orbits, each following a path determined by protocol and tradition, their movements creating a gentle, continuous motion that was both soothing and hypnotic. She found herself thinking of the women who had stood in this same position before her, queens and dauphines stretching back through centuries, all of them participating in this same daily ritual of transformation. As the final elements of her morning toilette were put in place, the jewelry that would catch and reflect light throughout the day, the powder that would create the perfect pallor expected of a queen, Marie Antoinette felt the familiar settling that occurred when the transformation was complete. The woman who had awakened in the bed behind her had been carefully, methodically replaced by the Queen of France, and yet something of that private self remained, hidden beneath the layers of silk and ceremony, waiting for those rare moments when she might be allowed to emerge again. The light from the windows had shifted imperceptibly during the dressing ritual, marking the passage of time in the same way that the ceremony itself marked the passage from private woman to public figure. She could see how the shadows had moved across the carpet, how the quality of illumination had changed from the soft gold of early morning to the clearer, more insistent light of mid-morning. This daily transformation of light seemed to mirror her own transformation, both following patterns that were as predictable as they were essential to the proper functioning of their respective worlds. In the final moments before she would leave this private sanctuary for the public rooms where her day would truly begin, Marie Antoinette allowed herself to notice the particular quality of silence that surrounded the completion of the morning ritual. The ladies in waiting had stepped back, their work finished, their voices stilled, creating a moment of pause that felt almost sacred in its completeness. The gentle sounds of the palace awakening filtered through the windows, the distant voices of servants going about their morning tasks, the soft percussion of doors opening and closing in corridors far from this protected space. She could feel the weight of the day ahead settling around her like another garment, invisible but no less real than the silk and jewels she now wore. The morning light that had witnessed her transformation would follow her through the hours to come, illuminating the careful performance that was her life, casting its democratic glow on both the genuine moments of human connection and the elaborate theater that surrounded them. In this light, she was both completely herself and completely other than herself, a paradox that had become as familiar as breathing, as natural as the sun's daily journey across the sky of Versailles. The writing desk by the window in Marie Antoinette's private salon held within its leather surface the accumulated weight of 1,000 letters, each one a careful negotiation between truth and necessity, between the words that could be written and the thoughts that must remain forever unspoken. The afternoon light fell across the polished wood in patterns that shifted slowly as the sun moved through its arc, creating a natural timepiece that marked the passage of hours spent in the delicate art of correspondence. Here, in this corner of her private world, surrounded by the gentle tick of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece and the distant murmur of the palace going about its business, she could almost pretend that words might bridge the vast distance between Versailles and Vienna, between the woman she had become and the daughter her mother still imagined her to be. The letter to Empress Maria Theresa lay before her, its opening lines already committed to paper in the careful script that had been drilled into her since childhood. The ink had dried on the formal salutations, the inquiries about health and weather that served as a kind of diplomatic foreplay, preparing the ground for whatever truths might be safely planted in the paragraphs that followed. But the pen remained poised above the paper, its tip heavy with fresh ink that threatened to betray her if she allowed it to record the thoughts that pressed most urgently against her consciousness. Through the window, the autumn garden of Versailles stretched away in all its geometric perfection, the carefully maintained beds and precisely trimmed hedges creating patterns that spoke of control and order even as the leaves began their slow surrender to the season. The view had become so familiar that she sometimes forgot to see it, but today it seemed to offer a kind of commentary on her situation, the way human will impose itself upon nature, creating beauty through constraint. The light that fell across the garden was the same light that illuminated her letter, connecting the two worlds through the simple fact of shared illumination. She had begun the letter as she began them all, with the comfortable formulas that allowed her to ease into the more difficult territory of actual communication. The weather at Versailles was fine, though autumn was making its presence known in the shortening days and the quality of light that seemed somehow more precious for its transience. The Dauphin was well, growing stronger each day, showing signs of the intelligence that would serve him well when his time came to rule. These were the safe subjects, the maternal and meteorological details that could be shared without fear of interception or misinterpretation. But between each line lay everything she could not say. The growing unrest that made itself known in whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, in the way certain courtiers no longer met her eyes with the same certainty they had once shown in the pamphlets that somehow found their way into the palace despite all efforts to keep them out. The pen moved slowly across the paper, each word weighed against the knowledge that her letters were read by others before they reached their destination, that every phrase would be examined for signs of weakness or desperation, or the kind of honesty that queens were not permitted to express. The scratch of quill on paper created a gentle rhythm that seemed to match her breathing, the physical act of writing providing a kind of meditation that allowed her thoughts to settle into the careful patterns required by diplomatic correspondence. She found herself thinking of her mother's hands, the way they had moved across similar paper when Maria Theresa had been teaching her the art of royal letter writing, the patience with which she had explained that a queen's words belonged not to herself but to history, that every sentence must be crafted with an awareness of its potential audience. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the passage of time with its steady tick, a sound that had become so much a part of the room's atmosphere that she noticed it only when she stopped to listen consciously. The mechanism was a marvel of precision, its golden hands moving with the same inexorable certainty as the sun across the sky, marking moments that could not be recalled or revised once they had passed. Time, she had learned, was perhaps the most democratic force in the world, affecting queens and commoners with equal indifference, and yet her relationship with it was complicated by the knowledge that her time was not entirely her own. As she continued writing, choosing each word with the care of a jeweler selecting stones for a crown, Marie Antoinette found herself aware of the particular quality of solitude that surrounded her even here, in this most private of spaces. The letter would travel across borders and through many hands before reaching her mother, but even if it arrived intact and unread by others, even if every word reached its intended recipient exactly as written, there would still remain the vast territory of experience that could not be captured in language, the loneliness of being unable to speak the full truth of her situation. The afternoon light continued its slow journey across the desk, illuminating first one section of the letter and then another, as if the sun itself were reading over her shoulder, offering its own commentary on the careful dance between revelation and concealment that characterized all royal correspondence. In this light, the ink seemed to shimmer slightly as it dried, each word becoming permanent in a way that felt both necessary and terrifying, committed to paper and therefore to history, part of the permanent record of what it meant to be Marie Antoinette in these particular days of an increasingly uncertain world. The silence in the salon was not empty but full, populated by the gentle sounds that had become the soundtrack to her contemplative hours. The soft settling of the fire in the grate, the almost inaudible whisper of air moving through the room, the distant echo of footsteps in corridors that seemed as far away as another country. These sounds created a cocoon of privacy that allowed her thoughts to move freely, even as her pen remained constrained by the requirements of diplomatic discretion. She paused in her writing to consider the particular challenge of describing her daily life to someone who remembered her as a young archduchess, full of the confidence that came from never having been tested by real adversity. How could she explain the weight of being constantly observed, the way every gesture was interpreted as a political statement, every choice of dress or entertainment scrutinized for signs of excess or frivolity? The woman her mother remembered would not have understood the careful calculations that now governed every aspect of her existence. The pen felt heavier in her hand as she contemplated the growing distance between her public role and her private understanding of herself. In her letters to Vienna, she was required to maintain the fiction of queenly confidence, to present herself as the successful daughter who had fulfilled her dynastic purpose by marrying well and producing an heir. But the reality was more complex, shot through with uncertainties and compromises that would have been impossible to imagine in the sheltered world of her Austrian childhood. As the afternoon wore on, the quality of light in the room began to change, becoming richer and more golden as the sun moved lower in the sky. This light seemed to add weight to her words, making each sentence feel more consequential, more permanent. She found herself thinking about the other letters that had been written at this desk, the correspondence that had shaped the course of European politics, the careful negotiations between royal houses that had determined the fate of millions of people who would never know their names had been mentioned in these private communications. The letter neared completion with the same formal courtesies that had begun it. The careful expressions of filial devotion and political loyalty that served as bookends to whatever truths had been permitted to emerge in the middle paragraphs. As she signed her name with the flourish that had been practiced until it became as automatic as breathing, Marie Antoinette felt the familiar mixture of relief and dissatisfaction that accompanied the completion of these diplomatic exercises in controlled honesty. The private gardens of the Petit Trianon existed in a world apart from the rigid geometry of Versailles proper, their carefully planned naturalness offering a kind of freedom that Marie Antoinette had found nowhere else in her prescribed existence. Here, among the winding paths that followed no protocol save that of aesthetic pleasure, she could walk without destination or purpose, her silk slippers making the softest whisper against gravel that had been chosen for its particular tone when disturbed by a careful step. The sound created a gentle rhythm that seemed to match the natural cadence of her thoughts, freed from the ceremonial pace that governed her movements in the formal gardens where every step was observed and interpreted. The October air carried within it the complex perfume of autumn, the sweet decay of leaves beginning their transformation, the last roses clinging to their thorny stems with a determination that spoke of beauty's refusal to surrender easily to time. She had chosen many of these plants herself, a rare exercise of personal preference in a life where most choices were made by others according to principles that had little to do with her own desires. Each tree, each flowering bush, each carefully placed stone bench represented a small rebellion against the prescribed beauty of formal French gardens, an assertion of the English style that valued the appearance of naturalness over the frank artifice of geometric perfection. As she walked, the gardeners withdrew at her approach with the discretion that had been trained into them through years of service, melting away into the landscape they tended so that she might have the illusion of solitude in this carefully maintained wilderness. Their absence was itself a kind of presence, the way their invisible labor made possible this moment of apparent spontaneity, this walk through gardens that appeared to have grown wild but had in fact been planned and planted and pruned with the same attention to detail that governed every other aspect of life at Versailles. The path she followed wound naturally through groves of trees that she had selected for the particular quality of light they would create, the way their branches would arch overhead to form a cathedral of green and gold that changed with the seasons and the hours of the day. Now, in the afternoon of this October day, the light fell through the leaves in patterns that seemed almost musical, creating a visual symphony that accompanied her solitary walk. She found herself thinking of the paintings she had seen of English landscapes, the way artists had learned to capture this quality of light that seemed to hold within it both melancholy and promise. The artificial stream that wound through the garden carried water over carefully placed stones, creating the sound of natural flow that had been achieved through the most sophisticated engineering. The gentle murmur of water over stone provided a constant backdrop to her thoughts, a sound that seemed to wash away the echoes of court conversation and ceremonial music that usually filled her consciousness. In this acoustic environment, she could almost hear her own thoughts clearly, freed from the constant commentary and interpretation that surrounded every other aspect of her existence. She paused beside a stone bench that had been positioned to take advantage of a particular view, the way the path curved around a grove of birch trees whose white bark seemed to glow in the filtered sunlight. The bench was worn smooth by weather and use, its surface warm from the sun that had been falling across it throughout the day. Here, she could sit without ceremony, without the careful arrangement of skirts and the consciousness of posture that governed her public appearances. The simple act of sitting where and how she pleased felt like a luxury more precious than any jewel in the crown treasury. The scent of late roses reached her from a nearby arbor, their perfume mixing with the earthier smells of autumn to create an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of time, beyond the reach of the political currents that were beginning to reshape France. These roses had been planted in her first year at the Petit Trianon, when the future had seemed as carefully planned and beautiful as the garden itself. Now they bloomed with the same determination they had shown then, indifferent to the changes that had occurred in the world beyond their thorny boundaries. Birds called from hidden perches in the carefully wild hedgerows, their voices adding another layer to the garden's gentle symphony. She had learned to identify their different songs during her walks, finding in their predictable patterns a kind of comfort that human conversation rarely provided. The birds, at least, were not performing for her benefit, were not conscious of her presence as anything more than another element in their familiar landscape. Their unconscious acceptance of her felt like a kind of benediction, a reminder that she existed not just as a queen, but as a creature among other creatures in the natural world. As the afternoon light began to shift toward evening, casting longer shadows across the winding paths, Marie Antoinette found herself reluctant to return to the palace, to the world of ceremony and observation that waited beyond the garden's borders. Here, among the plants she had chosen and the paths she had designed, she could almost remember what it felt like to make decisions based on nothing more complicated than personal preference, to choose beauty for its own sake rather than for its symbolic value or political implications. The garden held within its carefully planned naturalness a vision of the life she might have lived in a different world, a place where authenticity and artifice could coexist in the same space, where the appearance of freedom might be enough to sustain the soul. The deeper she walked into the garden's embrace, the more completely she felt herself released from the weight of her public identity. The winding path led her past a small grove of apple trees that she had insisted upon despite the protests of the head gardener, who had argued that fruit trees were too common for a queen's private garden. But she had loved the idea of trees that would provide both beauty and sustenance, that would connect her to the most basic human relationship with the natural world. Now, in October, the trees were heavy with fruit that glowed like lanterns in the dappled light, their branches bending under the weight of their abundance. She picked an apple as she passed, feeling the smooth skin warm from the afternoon sun, inhaling the clean scent that seemed to carry within it all the simplicity she had lost when she became queen. The act of eating fruit from her own tree, without ceremony or witnesses, felt like a small act of rebellion against the elaborate protocols that governed even her meals in the palace. The apple was sweet and crisp, its juice running down her chin in a way that would have horrified her ladies-in-waiting, and she found herself laughing at the simple pleasure of being temporarily ungoverned. The sound of her own laughter seemed to surprise the garden into a moment of deeper silence, as if even the birds were pausing to acknowledge this rare expression of unguarded joy. In that silence, she became aware of the profound peace that surrounded her, the way the garden held her in its green embrace like a benevolent parent protecting a child from the harsh realities of the adult world. The artificial stream continued its gentle murmur, the leaves rustled with the soft percussion of autumn wind, but these sounds seemed to deepen the silence rather than disturb it. As she continued her walk, following paths that led deeper into the garden's carefully planned wilderness, Marie Antoinette found herself thinking about the nature of authenticity in a life that was largely performance. Here, among the roses and apple trees and winding streams, she could almost believe that the woman who walked these paths was the real Marie Antoinette, not the queen who presided over court ceremonies or the political figure who appeared in the pamphlets that circulated through Paris. The garden seemed to offer the possibility of a self that existed independent of public role, a private identity that could flourish in the spaces between official duties. The afternoon was drawing toward its close when she finally turned back toward the palace, her steps slower now, reluctant to leave this sanctuary where she had been able to exist simply as a woman walking in a beautiful garden. The light was beginning to take on the golden quality of evening, casting longer shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers trying to hold on to the day. In this light, the garden appeared even more magical, transformed into a landscape that seemed to exist outside the ordinary flow of time, a place where the troubles of the world could be temporarily forgotten in the simple pleasure of being present in a beautiful space. The music room at Versailles existed in a realm of perfect acoustics and golden light, its walls designed to receive and reflect sound with the same precision that governed every other aspect of the palace's architecture. The harpsichord stood in the center of this carefully crafted space, like an altar dedicated to the mathematical precision of musical composition, its elaborate case decorated with gold leaf that caught and multiplied the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Here, surrounded by the gentle resonance of strings and the soft creak of the bench as she adjusted her position, Marie Antoinette could find a kind of transcendence that was available nowhere else in her prescribed existence. Monsieur Kreutzer sat in his customary chair beside the instrument, his presence both necessary and somehow invisible, the way a skilled teacher learns to provide guidance without intrusion. His approval or disapproval had long since ceased to matter to her in the way it once had. Now she played not for his assessment, but for the music itself, for the brief escape it offered from the weight of being perpetually observed and interpreted. The relationship between student and teacher had evolved over the years into something more complex, a shared understanding that music provided a sanctuary where the usual rules of court interaction could be temporarily suspended. The Mozart sonata lay open before her, its pages marked with the careful notations that represented years of practice and refinement. She knew this piece by heart, could play it with her eyes closed, but today each phrase seemed to carry new meaning, as if the composer had somehow anticipated this moment, this need for order in an increasingly chaotic world. Her fingers found the keys with the certainty of long familiarity, but her mind was engaged in the more complex task of discovering what the music might reveal about itself and about her in this particular performance. The notes fell like water from her fingertips, each one precise and necessary, building toward something larger than the sum of their parts. The harpsichord responded to her touch with the sensitivity of an instrument that had been crafted by masters who understood that music was not merely entertainment, but a form of communication that transcended the limitations of ordinary language. Each key she pressed created not just sound, but resonance, the way the strings vibrated in sympathy with each other to create harmonies that existed in the spaces between the written notes. The afternoon light that filled the room seemed to move in rhythm with the music, the way shadows shifted across the walls and floor as the sun progressed through its arc, creating a visual accompaniment to the auditory experience. She had often noticed this phenomenon during her practice sessions, the way light and sound seemed to collaborate in creating an atmosphere that existed outside of time, beyond the reach of the political and social pressures that governed the rest of her existence. In this light, playing this music, she could almost forget the weight of the crown that waited for her in her private chambers. The precise click of the keys provided a percussive foundation for the melodic lines that emerged from the strings, each note clear and distinct, yet part of a larger architectural structure that Mozart had designed with the same attention to proportion and balance that governed the palace itself. She found herself thinking of the composer as she played, imagining the moment when he had first conceived this particular sequence of notes, the way inspiration had moved through his consciousness and emerged as something that could be captured on paper and recreated by other hands, other minds, across years and distances. The room's perfect acoustics carried each note cleanly, allowing her to hear not just the melody she was creating, but the subtle resonances that emerged from the interaction between the instrument and the space that contained it. The walls themselves seemed to participate in the performance, their surfaces designed to enhance and enrich the sound without overwhelming it. She could feel the music moving through the air around her, filling the room with vibrations that seemed to touch something deeper than hearing, some part of her consciousness that responded to mathematical relationships made audible. As she moved through the more complex passages of the sonata, her fingers navigating the intricate patterns that Mozart had devised to challenge and delight the performer, Marie Antoinette found herself entering the state of focused attention that was perhaps the closest thing to meditation available to her in her public life. The music demanded complete presence, absolute attention to the relationship between intention and execution, between the written score and the living interpretation that emerged from her particular understanding of what the composer had attempted to capture. The silence that held between phrases felt as important as the notes themselves, spaces where the ear could rest and the mind could process what it had just received before moving on to the next musical idea. These pauses were not empty, but full of potential, pregnant with the promise of what was to come, the way a held breath contains within it the possibility of speech or song. She had learned to value these moments of silence as much as the moments of sound, understanding that music existed not just in the notes, but in the relationships between them. Monsieur Kreutzer nodded approvingly from his chair, but she was no longer playing for his approval or for the invisible audience that always surrounded a queen. She played for the music itself, for the brief escape it offered from the complications of existence, for the temporary freedom from self-consciousness that came when technique and inspiration aligned to create something that transcended the individual will of the performer and became, for a few precious moments, simply music, existing in its own perfect realm of mathematical beauty and emotional truth. The gentle resonance of the harpsichord strings seemed to linger in the air long after each note was struck, creating layers of sound that built upon each other like the careful construction of a cathedral. She could feel the vibrations through the wooden bench beneath her, through the floor itself, as if the entire room had become an extension of the instrument. This physical connection to the music reminded her of childhood, of placing her hands on the pianoforte in her mother's music room in Vienna and feeling the way sound traveled not just through air, but through solid matter, connecting her body to the source of the melody in ways that pure listening could never achieve. The late afternoon sun had begun to take on that particular quality of light that came only at this hour, golden and thick with dust motes that danced in the beams streaming through the tall windows. This light seemed to give weight to the music itself, as if the notes she played were becoming visible, taking on substance and color as they moved through the illuminated air. She had always been sensitive to the relationship between light and music, the way certain pieces seemed to demand particular qualities of illumination, the way this Mozart sonata seemed most itself when played in exactly this kind of warm, slanted sunlight. Her hands moved across the keys with the fluid grace that came only after years of disciplined practice, but her mind wandered to the composer himself, to the young man who had visited Versailles and played for her mother, the Empress, years before. She remembered his intensity, the way he had seemed to disappear into his own music, becoming a conduit for something larger than himself. Now, playing his composition, she felt she understood something of what he had experienced, this sense of being temporarily freed from the boundaries of individual consciousness, of becoming part of something universal and eternal. The harpsichord's mechanism responded to her touch with mechanical precision, each key connected to its corresponding string through a system of levers and jacks that had been perfected over centuries of craftsmanship. Yet this mechanical precision served something that was entirely beyond mechanism, something that emerged from the intersection of human intention and mathematical relationship, of emotional expression and physical law. She found comfort in this paradox, the way the most transcendent experiences often arose from the most carefully controlled circumstances. The music room itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the sonata, its proportions designed according to principles that ensured perfect acoustic balance. Every surface had been calculated to enhance the sound of the harpsichord, from the height of the ceiling to the placement of the windows, from the type of wood used in the paneling to the thickness of the carpet beneath her feet. Yet all this scientific precision served to create a space where science could be transcended, where the mathematical relationships that governed sound could become something approaching the divine. As the sonata progressed through its carefully structured movements, Marie Antoinette found herself thinking not of the technical challenges it presented, but of the emotional journey it traced, the way Mozart had used the formal constraints of the sonata form to create something that felt both inevitable and surprising. Each return to the main theme felt like coming home, yet each variation revealed new possibilities within familiar territory. This balance between security and discovery seemed to her a perfect metaphor for the kind of life she sometimes imagined might be possible, a life where duty and desire could coexist without constant tension. The gentle click and whisper of the harpsichord's action provided a subtle percussion beneath the melodic lines, a reminder of the instrument's mechanical nature even as it produced sounds that seemed to transcend all mechanical limitations. She had grown to love this aspect of the harpsichord, the way it revealed its own workings while simultaneously creating magic, the way it remained honestly itself while serving something far greater than itself. In this, she sometimes thought, it was not unlike her own position, required to be both human and symbol, individual and institution, authentic and performative all at once. The light has changed, though Marie Antoinette cannot say precisely how. It slants through the tall windows of her private apartments with the same golden warmth it has carried for all the years she has known these rooms. Yet something in its quality seems different this evening, as if the sun itself has shifted its attention elsewhere. The familiar shadows fall across the Persian carpets and settle into the corners of the chamber with their usual precision, but they seem deeper somehow, more substantial, as though they carry weight they did not possess yesterday. The perpetual whisper of water from the fountain in the courtyard below provides its endless accompaniment to the day's closing rituals. This sound has been the constant backdrop to her life at Versailles, as reliable as breathing, as present as the beating of her own heart. The gentle cascade and return of water against stone creates a rhythm that has measured countless evenings, countless preparations for dinner and entertainment, and the elaborate choreography of court life. In this atmosphere of flowing water and settling light, she moves through the familiar steps of her evening preparations, yet finds herself pausing at moments that have never required pause before. Madame Campan enters with her usual measured step, her face composed in the expression of professional attention that Marie Antoinette has come to read as easily as text upon a page. But today there is something else there, a quality of watchfulness that extends beyond the normal requirements of service. The madame's eyes seem to linger a fraction longer on her mistress's face, as though seeking to memorize what they see, and when she speaks, her voice carries an undertone that Marie Antoinette cannot identify. Your Majesty, dinner will be served in the small dining room this evening, Madame Campan announces, and the words themselves are unremarkable. Such changes in arrangement happen frequently, dictated by the size of the evening's company or the Queen's own preferences. Yet something in the way the announcement is made, some subtle emphasis or hesitation, causes Marie Antoinette to look up from the letter she has been reading. The small dining room, she repeats, though she knows she has heard correctly. The question emerges not from confusion, but from a need to fill the space that has opened around Madame Campan's words, a space that seems to contain more than the simple information conveyed. The water continues its gentle conversation with stone in the courtyard below, and Marie Antoinette finds herself listening to it with unusual attention. How many times has she heard this sound without truly hearing it? How many evenings has it provided the background to her thoughts while she dressed for dinner, while she selected jewelry, while she considered which gown would best suit the evening's requirements? The sound seems more present now, more insistent in its gentle persistence, as though it too senses that something has shifted in the familiar order of things. Her ladies move about the chamber with their practiced efficiency, preparing the evening's wardrobe, arranging the accessories that will complete her appearance for dinner. Their movements follow the same patterns they have traced for years, the same careful choreography of service that has shaped every evening of her adult life. Yet Marie Antoinette finds herself watching them with new attention, noticing details that have previously escaped her notice. The way Madame de Polignac's hands pause for just a moment before selecting a particular jewel, the manner in which the Duchess de Guiche arranges the folds of the evening gown, smoothing fabric that already lies perfectly smooth. There is conversation, but it seems more careful than usual, words chosen with greater precision, topics approached and then abandoned before they can fully develop. When Marie Antoinette asks about the arrangements for tomorrow's morning ride, the response comes with a hesitation so brief it might be imagined, yet she finds herself noting it, filing it away with the other small observations that have accumulated throughout the day like dust gathering in corners. The evening light continues to change, growing richer and more golden as it approaches the hour of sunset. Through the windows, she can see the formal gardens extending toward the horizon, their geometric patterns as perfect and unchanging as they have always been. The fountains there continue their own water songs, adding their voices to the gentle symphony that has provided the soundtrack to her life in this place. Everything appears exactly as it should, yet she cannot shake the feeling that she is seeing it all through slightly different eyes, as though she has awakened from a long dream to find the world subtly altered. When she moves to the window to look out over the courtyard, the sound of water becomes more pronounced, its gentle falling and returning creating a rhythm that seems to match something deep within her chest. She has stood at this window countless times, has watched the light change across the stone facades and formal plantings, has observed the comings and goings of courtiers and servants and visitors, but tonight the view seems to offer something different, some quality of attention or significance that transforms the familiar into something almost foreign. The servants below move about their business with the same purposeful efficiency they have always displayed, yet their movements seem more hurried, their conversations more hushed. Or perhaps it is only her imagination, influenced by the strange quality of light and the unusual attention she finds herself paying to details that normally pass unnoticed. The water continues its eternal conversation, and she lets its sound wash over her thoughts as she tries to identify what has changed, what has shifted in the carefully ordered world that has contained her for so long. Madame Campan approaches with the evening's jewelry, and Marie Antoinette turns from the window to submit to the familiar ritual of adornment. The diamonds catch the changing light and throw it back in fragments, creating small rainbows that dance across the walls and ceiling. These are the same jewels she has worn countless times, their weight and brilliance as familiar as her own reflection. Yet tonight they seem to carry additional significance, as though they are being placed upon her for the first time, or perhaps for the last. The thought arrives unbidden, and she pushes it away, returning her attention to the immediate requirements of the evening. There will be dinner and conversation, and perhaps music afterward. The familiar rhythms of court life will continue as they always have, measured by the sound of water and marked by the changing light. Yet as her ladies complete their ministrations, and she prepares to leave her private chambers for the public spaces below, Marie Antoinette carries with her the sense that something fundamental has shifted, that the world she has known with such certainty has revealed itself to be less solid than she had believed. The water in the courtyard continues its gentle falling, and she listens to it one more time before turning toward the door, letting its constant voice remind her that some things, at least, remain unchanged in a world that suddenly seems full of subtle transformations she cannot yet name or understand. The writing desk held the accumulated weight of years, its polished surface reflecting the gentle flicker of candles that had burned through countless evenings of correspondence. Marie Antoinette settled into the familiar chair, her silk dress rustling softly against the upholstered seat, and reached for the lower drawer where she kept her finest writing paper. The drawer resisted slightly, as it always did, requiring a gentle coaxing that had become as much a part of her evening ritual as the lighting of the candles themselves. Inside, beneath the cream-colored sheets of paper she sought, her fingers encountered something unexpected. Silk ribbons, pale blue and rose, bound bundles of letters she had forgotten were there. The ribbons had been tied with care, each bundle representing a different correspondent, a different season of her life at Versailles. She lifted them out with the reverence one might show to pressed flowers, these fragments of relationships preserved in ink and paper. The first bundle bore her mother's familiar seal, the Habsburg eagle pressed into red wax that had softened and hardened again countless times in the drawer's confines. Maria Theresa's letters, written in her precise German script, had arrived regularly for years, each one a mixture of maternal concern and imperial instruction. Marie Antoinette untied the ribbon slowly, her fingers remembering the texture of silk even as her mind prepared to revisit words she had read so many times before. The earliest letters, yellowed now at the edges, carried the warmth of a mother writing to a daughter newly arrived in a foreign court. "My dearest child," they began, "I pray this letter finds you in good health and growing happiness." The words flowed with intimate concern about her adjustment to French customs, gentle reminders about protocol, affectionate inquiries about her daily life. Maria Theresa's voice seemed to speak directly from the pages, as if she were sitting beside her daughter in the candlelit room. But as Marie Antoinette progressed through the correspondence, arranging the letters by date with careful attention to the progression of months and years, she began to notice subtle changes in her mother's tone. The salutations remained the same, the closing expressions of love unchanged, yet something had shifted in the body of the letters. Where once Maria Theresa had written, "I trust your natural wisdom will guide you," she later wrote, "I must counsel you to consider more carefully the impressions you create." The difference was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The candles flickered as a gentle breeze moved through the room, carrying with it the scent of roses from the garden beyond her windows. Marie Antoinette paused in her reading, holding a letter from 3 years past, then one from the previous winter. Side by side, they revealed a progression she had not noticed when receiving them individually. Her mother's concerns had grown more specific, her advice more pointed. References to certain reports that reached Vienna began to appear, delicately phrased but unmistakably present. She set aside her mother's correspondence and reached for another bundle, this one tied with rose silk. These were letters from various nobles at court, congratulations on her marriage, invitations to private gatherings, the social currency of Versailles life. The earliest among them glowed with the enthusiasm of courtiers welcoming a new queen. "Your Majesty's grace illuminates our court," wrote the Duchess de Polignac. "We are blessed by your presence among us." Yet here too, as she arranged them chronologically, a pattern emerged. The effusive praise remained, but it became more formal, more carefully constructed. Where courtiers had once written with spontaneous warmth, their later letters showed the precision of words chosen with greater consideration. Compliments that had once been personal became general. References to shared moments grew fewer, replaced by more distant expressions of loyalty and service. The realization came to her gradually, like dawn breaking over the palace gardens. It was not that anyone had written anything improper or unkind. Each letter, taken individually, was perfectly appropriate, filled with the respect and affection due to a queen. But together, arranged in sequence, they told a different story. They revealed a subtle cooling, a gradual increase in the distance between writer and recipient. She thought of the servants she had encountered earlier, their curtsies perhaps a fraction less deep, their eyes meeting hers for a moment, less time than they once had. She remembered Monsieur Kreutzer's slightly more formal manner during their music lesson, the way he had arranged the sheet music with extra care, as if creating a small barrier between them. These changes, like the evolution in her correspondence, were so gradual as to be nearly invisible when experienced day by day. The clock in the corner chimed 10, its gentle notes floating through the quiet room. The sound seemed to settle into the very fabric of the evening, joining the soft whisper of turning pages and the almost inaudible crackle of candle flames consuming their wicks. Marie Antoinette gathered the letters carefully, but found herself reluctant to return them immediately to their drawer. Instead, she held them in her lap, feeling their collective weight, considering what they represented not just as individual communications, but as a record of time's passage. There was something almost archaeological about this discovery, she reflected, like finding layers of sediment that revealed the gradual changes in a riverbed. These letters showed how relationships could shift so slowly that the transformation became visible only when viewed across months and years. The candlelight seemed to deepen her contemplation, creating a cocoon of warm illumination that made the rest of the room fade into gentle shadow. She found herself thinking of her childhood in Austria, of the letters she had written to friends and cousins before her marriage brought her to France. Those early correspondences had been filled with the immediate concerns of youth, descriptions of dresses and dances, complaints about tutors, excitement about upcoming celebrations. The voice in those letters had been unguarded, spontaneous, free from the careful consideration that now marked even her most private thoughts. When had that change occurred? She could not pinpoint a specific moment when her natural voice had given way to something more measured, more conscious of its audience. Perhaps it had happened gradually, like the changes she was now discovering in her correspondence. Perhaps the transformation had been so subtle that she had not noticed it happening, just as others might not have noticed their own gradual shift toward greater formality in their letters to her. The roses beyond her window released their evening fragrance more intensely now, as if the cooling air concentrated their perfume. The scent drifted through the partially open casement, mixing with the warm smell of melting candle wax and the faint mustiness of old paper. These sensory elements seemed to weave together into something that felt like the essence of memory itself, sweet, complex, touched with the poignancy of time's passage. Marie Antoinette retied the silk ribbons around each bundle, her movements slow and deliberate. She had found what she came looking for, writing paper for a letter she intended to compose. But she had discovered something else entirely, the documentary evidence of a shift so subtle that it could only be perceived in accumulation, like sediment settling slowly at the bottom of a clear stream. As she prepared her writing materials, selecting a fresh quill and checking the level of ink in the crystal well, she found herself thinking not with alarm, but with a kind of peaceful recognition. The letters had not revealed anything shocking or dramatic. They had simply shown her what she had perhaps sensed without acknowledging, that relationships, like seasons, change gradually, and that the warmth of one period naturally gives way to the different temperature of another. The act of writing, she realized, was itself a form of hope. Each letter represented a belief that words could bridge distance, that thoughts committed to paper could carry something essential from one person to another. Even as the tone of her correspondence had evolved, even as the responses she received had grown more formal, the fundamental act of reaching out through written words remained unchanged. The candles burned steadily beside her, their flames creating a circle of golden light in the gathering darkness of her apartments. Outside, the palace settled into its evening rhythm, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the faint sound of music from another room, another gathering, another moment in the endless succession of days that made up life at Versailles. The music seemed to float on the same gentle breeze that carried the rose scent, creating a backdrop of quiet activity that spoke of life continuing its patterns even as individual relationships shifted and evolved. She dipped her quill in ink and began to write, her words flowing across the paper with the same grace that had always marked her correspondence, even as she understood now that the world receiving those words had changed, quietly and irrevocably, around her. The scratch of the quill against paper joined the other gentle sounds of the evening, the distant music, the whisper of breeze through roses, the soft settling of wax as candles burned lower. In this atmosphere of quiet contemplation, surrounded by the evidence of time's subtle transformations, she continued to write, each word a small act of faith in the enduring power of human connection, even as that connection evolved in ways too gradual to be perceived in any single moment. The corridors of Versailles stretched before Marie Antoinette like familiar rivers of marble and gold, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness by generations of servants who had walked these same paths. The wall sconces cast dancing shadows that played across the ornate wallpaper, creating patterns that shifted with each flicker of flame. She moved through these spaces with the unconscious grace of someone who had navigated them for years, her silk slippers whispering against the stone floors in a rhythm as natural as breathing. Yet tonight, as she made her way from her apartments toward the main reception halls, she found herself paying attention to details that had previously existed at the edges of her awareness. The palace had not changed. The same tapestries hung from their appointed places, the same portraits gazed down from gilded frames, the same scent of beeswax and distant cooking fires filled the air. But something in the quality of her attention had shifted, as if she were seeing these familiar spaces through slightly different eyes. A chambermaid was arranging fresh flowers in one of the tall Chinese vases that stood in alcoves along the corridor. Marie Antoinette had seen this same woman perform this same task hundreds of times, always with the same careful attention to the placement of each bloom. But tonight she noticed how the woman's movements seemed hurried, how she kept glancing toward the approaching footsteps, how her curtsy when the queen passed was perfectly correct, yet somehow abbreviated, completed with efficiency rather than the lingering respect that had once characterized such encounters. The woman's eyes, Marie Antoinette observed, did not quite meet hers, not in any way that could be called disrespectful. The gaze was appropriately lowered, the deference entirely proper. Yet there was something in the quality of that averted glance that suggested not reverence, but a kind of careful neutrality, as if the chambermaid were performing a role rather than expressing genuine sentiment. Further along the corridor, two footmen were engaged in quiet conversation near one of the tall windows that looked out onto the palace gardens. Their voices carried the low, confidential tone of servants discussing household matters, nothing unusual in itself. But as Marie Antoinette approached, their conversation ceased with an abruptness that seemed almost rehearsed. They bowed with perfect precision, their faces arranged in expressions of respectful attention, yet she sensed that their thoughts remained with whatever topic had occupied them moments before. She paused near a doorway that led to one of the smaller reception rooms, not to eavesdrop, but simply to observe the life of the palace continuing around her. Through the partially open door, she could see several ladies-in-waiting engaged in needlework, their heads bent over their embroidery frames. Their conversation was soft, punctuated by gentle laughter, the kind of intimate discourse that had always characterized the informal moments of court life. But when one of the women noticed the queen's presence in the doorway, the quality of the conversation changed instantly. The laughter faded, the voices became more measured, and the topics shifted from whatever had been engaging them to safer, more general subjects. It was not that they became silent or uncomfortable. The transition was too smooth for that. Rather, it was as if they had moved from one language to another, from the private vocabulary of genuine exchange to the public discourse of court propriety. Marie Antoinette continued her walk, her observations accumulating like brushstrokes on a canvas, each small detail adding to a larger picture she was only beginning to perceive. A secretary hurried past with an armload of documents, his beau quick and distracted. A group of minor nobles who had been laughing at some shared joke fell into more formal postures as she approached, their smiles becoming polite rather than spontaneous. None of these changes were dramatic. No one was rude or obviously disrespectful. The machinery of court protocol continued to function with its usual precision, yet there was something different in the atmosphere, a subtle shift in temperature that she could feel without being able to name precisely. She thought of the ocean, which she had seen only once during a visit to the coast years earlier. She remembered how the water could appear calm on the surface while deeper currents moved beneath, invisible but powerful. The palace felt like that now, its surface routines unchanged while something deeper had shifted direction. The evening light filtering through the tall windows had begun to take on the golden quality that marked the transition from day to night. This light seemed to soften the edges of everything it touched, creating an atmosphere of gentle melancholy that matched her contemplative mood. The palace at this hour had always possessed a particular beauty when the harsh clarity of midday gave way to something more forgiving, more mysterious. In the grand gallery, she encountered the Marquise de Maintenon, an elderly woman who had known the palace since the time of the Sun King. The Marquise's curtsy was as deep and graceful as ever, her greeting warm with the familiarity of long acquaintance. Yet even here, Marie Antoinette sensed a subtle difference. The older woman's eyes held a kind of careful kindness, as if she were looking at someone who required gentle handling. "Your Majesty appears thoughtful this evening," the Marquise observed, her voice carrying genuine concern. "I find myself noticing things I had not seen before," Marie Antoinette replied, the words coming to her without premeditation. The Marquise nodded slowly, her expression understanding in a way that suggested she too had observed changes in the palace's atmosphere. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "we see most clearly in the evening light." They parted with the usual courtesies, but the exchange lingered in Marie Antoinette's mind as she continued her walk. The Marquise had not said anything specific, yet her words seemed to acknowledge the very observations that had been occupying the Queen's thoughts. It was as if the older woman had confirmed something that Marie Antoinette had not even fully articulated to herself. The conversation had lasted only moments, but it carried the weight of deeper understanding. The Marquise, with her decades of experience at court, had surely witnessed many such subtle shifts in atmosphere, many gradual changes in the way relationships evolved within the palace walls. Her gentle acknowledgement suggested that what Marie Antoinette was observing was neither unusual nor alarming, but simply part of the natural rhythm of court life. As she walked on, Marie Antoinette found herself thinking about the nature of observation itself. How much of what she was noticing tonight had always been present, waiting to be seen? How much was genuinely new, and how much was simply the result of her own changed perspective? The question seemed to hover in the air around her, as tangible as the scent of beeswax from the candles or the distant sound of voices from other parts of the palace. The palace clock chimed the half-hour, its deep notes resonating through the corridors and chambers. The sound seemed to ripple through the building like water, touching every room and hallway before fading into the general hum of evening activity. Marie Antoinette found herself in the main reception hall, where a few courtiers lingered in quiet conversation. The enormous chandeliers cast warm light over the gilded surfaces, creating the same magnificent atmosphere that had always characterized this space. Yet even here, she noticed subtle differences in the way people positioned themselves, the slightly greater distances they maintained, the more careful quality of their interactions. It was as if everyone had taken a small step backward, not enough to be obvious or rude, but sufficient to create a new geography of social space. The conversations continued. The laughter still arose at appropriate moments, but everything seemed to occur within a framework of greater circumspection. She observed a young courtier approaching an older noble, the way he paused just slightly longer before speaking, the way his bow was perhaps a degree deeper than it might have been in previous months. These were minute adjustments, barely perceptible, but they suggested a recalibration of social relationships that extended throughout the court. The realization that she was witnessing something systemic rather than personal brought with it a strange sense of relief. If the changes she observed were part of a larger pattern, then they were not necessarily a reflection of any particular failing on her part. They were simply evidence of the way institutions evolved, the way social systems adjusted themselves in response to pressures too complex and numerous to identify precisely. As she made her way back toward her apartments, she reflected on what she had observed. The palace corridors seemed to embrace her with their familiar warmth, the soft lighting and gentle sounds creating an atmosphere of continuity that transcended any temporary shifts in social dynamics. The building itself, with its centuries of accumulated history, seemed to whisper reassurance that it had witnessed countless such changes, countless adjustments in the delicate balance of court relationships. It was not that anyone had treated her badly or shown any sign of disloyalty. The respect, the deference, the elaborate courtesies of palace life all remained intact. But beneath these surface forms, something had changed. The warmth that had once animated these interactions had cooled slightly, replaced by a more careful, more measured quality of attention. The evening air carried with it the complex perfume of the palace, roses from the gardens, wax from countless candles, the faint mustiness of ancient tapestries, the lingering traces of dinner preparations from the kitchens far below. These scents had always been part of her daily experience, but tonight they seemed more vivid, more significant, as if her heightened awareness had sharpened all her senses. The realization came to her not as a shock, but as a quiet recognition, like understanding a piece of music she had heard many times before, but never quite grasped. The palace was the same, the people were the same, the routines continued unchanged. But the feeling that connected all these elements had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from the easy warmth of genuine affection to the cooler temperature of duty properly performed. As she reached her apartments, Marie Antoinette paused at her door, looking back down the corridor she had just traversed. The candles in their sconces continued to burn steadily, casting the same warm light they had always provided. The palace would continue its evening routines, the servants would complete their tasks, the courtiers would retire to their chambers, and tomorrow would bring another day of the same careful choreography she had observed tonight. In this continuity, she found a kind of peace, an acceptance of change as natural as the progression from day to night, as inevitable as the turning of seasons. The music room welcomed Marie Antoinette with its familiar embrace of polished wood and gentle candlelight, the harpsichord's elegant curves reflecting the flames that danced in their crystal holders. Monsieur Kreutzer was already present, arranging sheet music with the same methodical care she had always admired in him. His movements were precise, economical, each page placed exactly where it should be for the evening's lesson. Yet, as she settled onto the bench, adjusting her silk dress around her, she found herself observing details in his manner that had previously escaped her notice. The music master's bow was as deep and respectful as ever, his greeting warm with the familiarity of their long association. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that had guided her musical education for years. "I have selected several pieces that I believe will please you this evening." But there was something in his tone, a subtle formality that seemed to create a small distance between them, as if he were speaking to her across a space that had not existed in their previous lessons. She began with scales, her fingers finding their familiar positions on the keys, the muscle memory of years of practice guiding her movements. The harpsichord responded with its characteristic bright clarity, each note distinct and crystalline in the room's perfect acoustics. Monsieur Kreutzer listened with his usual attention, his head tilted slightly to catch every nuance of her playing, but she sensed something different in the quality of his listening. Where once his corrections had been offered with the easy intimacy of a teacher who knew his students' capabilities and limitations, now they came wrapped in slightly more formal language. "Perhaps Your Majesty might consider a lighter touch in this passage," he suggested, rather than his former, "Try letting your wrists float here," as we practiced. The advice was equally valuable, the musical insight unchanged, but the manner of its delivery had shifted toward greater deference. She moved on to a piece by Rameau, one they had worked on together for months, until she could play it with confidence and expression. Her fingers found the familiar patterns, the intricate harmonies flowing from the keyboard with practiced ease. But when she reached a particularly challenging section and made a small error, stumbling slightly over a rapid passage, Monsieur Kreutzer's response revealed the change she had been sensing. In the past, he would have stopped her immediately, his hands gesturing to illustrate the correct fingering, his voice animated with the enthusiasm of a teacher eager to share his knowledge. "No, no," he would have said, "feel the shape of the phrase, let your hand follow the music's natural curve." Tonight, however, he allowed her to finish the entire piece before offering his correction, and when it came, it was delivered with careful courtesy. "The passage in the third section might benefit from a different approach," he said, his words chosen with obvious consideration. "If Your Majesty would permit me to suggest an alternative fingering." The musical advice was sound, his expertise as evident as ever, but the easy back and forth of their former lessons had been replaced by something more measured, more conscious of the formal distance between queen and subject. She attempted the passage again, incorporating his suggestion, and this time managed it more successfully. His praise, when it came, was generous and sincere. "Beautifully executed, Your Majesty. Your musical sensitivity continues to develop remarkably." Yet even his compliments seemed to have acquired an additional layer of formality, as if he were speaking for an invisible audience rather than simply sharing his genuine response to her playing. The candles flickered as a gentle breeze moved through the room, carrying with it the scent of the palace gardens and the faint aroma of dinner being prepared in distant kitchens. Outside the tall windows, darkness had settled over the grounds, transforming the familiar landscapes into mysterious shadows punctuated by the occasional flicker of torches along the pathways. Marie Antoinette selected another piece, a gentle air by Couperin that had always been one of her favorites. As she played, she found herself thinking about the evolution of her relationship with Monsieur Kreutzer. He had come to her as a young musician, recommended by her mother's court, nervous but eager to serve. Over the years, they had developed the kind of easy working relationship that allowed for honest criticism and genuine praise, for the small jokes and shared frustrations that made learning a pleasure rather than a duty. Now, as she moved through the familiar melodies, she realized that this easy intimacy had gradually been replaced by something more careful, more aware of protocol. It was not that Monsieur Kreutzer had become less skilled or less dedicated to her musical education. If anything, his teaching had become more polished, more professionally perfect. But the human warmth that had once animated their lessons had cooled into something more correct, more appropriate to the formal relationship between a queen and her music master. When she finished the Couperin, he offered his usual detailed analysis of her performance, pointing out the passages where her expression had been particularly effective, suggesting areas where she might experiment with different approaches. His musical insights were as valuable as ever, his ability to guide her development unchanged. Yet she found herself missing the spontaneous enthusiasm he had once shown, the way he would lean forward in excitement when she mastered a difficult section, the small expressions of pleasure that had made their lessons feel like shared discoveries rather than formal instruction. The lesson continued with its familiar rhythm of performance, correction, and improvement. They worked through several more pieces, each one receiving Monsieur Kreutzer's careful attention and thoughtful guidance. The music filled the room with its beauty, the harpsichord's voice as clear and expressive as ever, the acoustic properties of the space creating the perfect environment for their work together. Yet beneath the surface success of the lesson, Marie Antoinette sensed the presence of something that had not been there before. It was not discomfort exactly, nor any kind of tension or conflict. Rather, it was a subtle awareness of boundaries that had previously been invisible, a consciousness of roles and proprieties that had once been taken for granted. As the lesson drew to its close, Monsieur Kreutzer gathered his music with the same methodical care he had shown at the beginning. His final bow was as respectful as ever, his expressions of gratitude for the privilege of serving as her music master sincere and appropriately phrased. "Thank you, Your Majesty, for another rewarding lesson. I look forward to our continued work together." But as he prepared to leave, she caught something in his manner that confirmed her observations. He moved with the careful precision of someone conscious of being observed, his gestures slightly more formal than they had once been. The easy familiarity that had developed over years of shared musical exploration had been replaced by something more conscious of propriety, more aware of the distance that protocol demanded between a queen and her subjects. After he had gone, Marie Antoinette remained at the harpsichord, her hands resting on the keys without pressing them. The silence in the room seemed to echo with the music they had just shared, but also with the recognition of how subtly the context of that sharing had changed. The music itself remained beautiful, the teaching as expert as ever, but the human connection that had once made these lessons a refuge from the formalities of court life had been quietly transformed into something more careful, more conscious of boundaries. The candles continued to burn steadily, their flames creating pools of warm light in the gathering darkness. Outside, the palace settled into its evening rhythm, but here in the music room, she found herself contemplating the strange alchemy by which relationships could change so gradually that the transformation was only visible in retrospect, like watching the slow shift of shadows as the sun moved across the sky. The English garden lay transformed in the embrace of night, its carefully planned naturalness taking on a different character under the gentle illumination of moon and stars. Marie Antoinette moved along the familiar gravel paths, her white dress seeming to float like a spirit among the carefully arranged trees and shrubs that had been designed to evoke the countryside she had never known but had always imagined. The garden that had been her refuge from the formal geometries of Versailles now welcomed her into its deeper mysteries, its shadows and silver light creating a space for contemplation that the bright clarity of day could not provide. The night air carried the perfume of flowers that bloomed only in darkness, jasmine and night-scented stock releasing their intoxicating sweetness into the cool atmosphere. These were scents that belonged to solitude and reflection, fragrances that seemed to encourage the kind of deep thinking that was impossible amid the constant activity of court life. She breathed deeply, allowing the garden's perfumes to fill her senses as she walked slowly along paths that curved and wandered with studied informality. Water trickled constantly from the small stream she had insisted upon when the garden was designed, its gentle murmur providing a counterpoint to the deeper silence of the night. The sound was meant to evoke English brooks, though she had never heard a real one. Now it seemed to speak to her of continuity and change, of water that was always moving yet always present, always the same, yet never identical from one moment to the next. She paused beside the stream, watching how the moonlight caught the surface of the moving water, creating patterns of light that shifted and reformed with each gentle current. The sight reminded her of the letters she had discovered earlier, how their meaning had become clear only when she arranged them in sequence, allowing the pattern of gradual change to emerge from what had seemed like static correspondence. The servant's altered manner, Monsieur Kreutzer's increased formality, the subtle cooling she had detected in her correspondence, all of these observations settled in her mind like pieces of a puzzle that was finally beginning to reveal its shape. Not a dramatic picture of crisis or conflict, but something more subtle and perhaps more profound. The quiet recognition that the world around her had been changing while she had remained focused on the daily routines that had always structured her life. She thought of her mother's letters, how they had evolved from warm maternal guidance to more careful diplomatic counsel. Maria Theresa had not stopped loving her daughter, but she had begun to see her differently, to understand her situation at Versailles in terms that required more cautious language, more considered advice. The change reflected not any failure on Marie Antoinette's part, but a shift in the larger circumstances that surrounded her life. An owl called softly from somewhere in the darkness beyond the garden's borders, its voice carrying across the still air with haunting beauty. The sound seemed to emphasize the solitude of the night, but also its peace. Here, away from the constant observation of court life, she could allow her thoughts to follow their natural course without the need to maintain the composed expression that was expected of a queen. She walked on, following a path that led to a small grove where several trees had been planted to create a natural bower. The grass beneath her feet was damp with dew, and she felt the moisture seeping through her silk slippers, connecting her more directly to the earth beneath. This was not the polished marble of palace floors, but something more fundamental, more honest in its response to her presence. In the grove, she found the stone bench that had been placed to provide a resting spot for contemplation. The bench was simple, designed to look as if it might have been naturally occurring, though of course it had been carefully crafted and positioned to provide the perfect view of the garden's most picturesque elements. She settled onto it, arranging her dress around her, and allowed herself to fully consider what she had learned during this evening of quiet observation. The changes she had detected were not signs of any immediate crisis or danger. No one had been disrespectful or disloyal. The elaborate machinery of court protocol continued to function with its usual precision, yet something fundamental had shifted in the quality of her relationships with the people around her. The easy warmth that had once characterized her interactions had been replaced by something more careful, more conscious of boundaries and proprieties. She understood now that this transformation had been gradual, so subtle that it could only be perceived when viewed from a sufficient distance. Like the slow change of seasons, it had happened day by day, almost imperceptibly, until the accumulation of small alterations had created a substantially different atmosphere. The realization brought with it not fear, but a kind of peaceful acceptance. She had always known intellectually that her position as queen placed her in a unique relationship to the world around her. But she had somehow imagined that the human connections she had formed with servants, teachers, correspondents existed in a realm separate from the political realities of her role. Now she understood that no such separation was possible, that even the most personal relationships were inevitably shaped by the larger currents of history and circumstance. The stars shone clearly in the dark sky above, their light traveling across unimaginable distances to reach her eyes. The sight reminded her of the letters from her mother, how they had carried Maria Theresa's thoughts and concerns across the miles between Vienna and Versailles. But just as starlight showed the stars as they had been years ago, rather than as they were in the present moment, perhaps her correspondence and relationships had been showing her a version of reality that was already changing even as she experienced it. A gentle breeze moved through the garden, rustling the leaves and carrying new combinations of night fragrances to her senses. The sound was soothing, like a lullaby sung by the garden itself. She felt held by the space she had created, protected by its informality from the rigid demands of palace life, free to think thoughts that would have been impossible in the more public areas of Versailles. The palace behind her glowed with warm light from countless windows, each one representing a room where life continued according to its ancient patterns. Servants moved through corridors, courtiers gathered in drawing rooms. The endless business of royal life proceeded with its customary precision. But here in her garden she existed temporarily outside those patterns, free to observe and understand without the need to immediately respond or react. As she sat in the peaceful darkness, Marie Antoinette found herself thinking not of what might come next, but of the strange beauty of recognition itself. There was something almost liberating in finally seeing clearly what had been happening around her, in understanding that the subtle changes she had detected were not signs of personal failure, but evidence of larger forces at work in the world. The night embraced her thoughts with gentle acceptance, and she realized that this moment of solitary reflection in her garden might be one of the most honest she had experienced in years. Here, surrounded by the artificial naturalness she had created as a refuge from court life, she had found something genuinely authentic, the quiet courage to see her situation clearly and accept it without illusion or despair. The servants had been dismissed early that evening, all save Madame Campan, who moved through the bathing chamber with the quiet efficiency that had marked her service for so many years. Marie Antoinette watched from the doorway as steam began to rise from the marble bath, the water heated to precisely the temperature she preferred, neither too warm nor merely tepid, but but that perfect heat that seemed to match the rhythm of her own blood. The chamber itself had been designed for such moments, its walls lined with mirrors that caught and multiplied the candlelight until the room seemed to glow from within. Rose petals had been scattered across the water's surface, their deep red contrasting with the white marble, and the air was thick with the scent of lavender oil, the same blend that had been prepared for her since her earliest days at Versailles. Everything was exactly as it had always been, yet tonight she found herself noticing details that had long since become invisible through familiarity. The way Madame Campan tested the water with her fingertips, the slight adjustment she made to the arrangement of towels warming by the fire, the careful precision with which she placed the crystal bottles of oils and perfumes within easy reach. These small rituals, performed countless times, had acquired a weight that Marie Antoinette had not felt before, as though each gesture carried within it the accumulated meaning of all the times it had been performed. "The water is ready, Your Majesty," Madame Campan said, her voice carrying its usual respectful neutrality, though Marie Antoinette thought she detected something else there, a tenderness that had not been present in earlier years. Perhaps it was merely her imagination, or perhaps they had all begun to sense that the world around them was shifting in ways that could not be controlled or predicted. Marie Antoinette moved into the room, her silk slippers silent against the heated marble floor. The warmth rose around her like an embrace, and she felt the tension she had carried in her shoulders throughout the day begin to ease. Here, in this space that had been created entirely for her comfort, she could allow herself to forget, for a few precious hours, the weight of the crown and the growing unrest that seemed to press against the palace walls like a gathering storm. She began to undress slowly, not from any sense of ceremony, but because she found herself reluctant to rush toward the end of this ritual. Each garment that fell away seemed to carry with it some portion of the day's concerns, the endless meetings and audiences, the careful navigation of court politics, the constant awareness of being watched and judged. The elaborate gown, with its layers of silk and intricate embroidery, pooled at her feet like a discarded identity, and she stepped free of it with something approaching relief. The corset came next, unlaced by Madame Campan's practiced hands, and Marie Antoinette felt her ribs expand fully for the first time since morning. The sensation was so profound that she paused, one hand pressed to her chest, marveling at the simple pleasure of breathing deeply. When had such a basic human function become a luxury to be savored? When had the act of existing in her own skin become something she could only fully experience in private? Steam continued to rise from the bath, creating patterns in the candlelight that shifted and dissolved before she could fully comprehend them. The water moved gently, stirred by some invisible current, and the rose petals drifted across its surface like fallen thoughts. She had bathed in this tub hundreds of times, perhaps thousands, but tonight she found herself seeing it with fresh eyes, as though she were a visitor to her own life. The marble felt smooth and cool beneath her feet as she approached the bath's edge. The contrast between the heated air and the stone created a sensation that was both grounding and ethereal, anchoring her to the physical world while simultaneously lifting her above its immediate concerns. She dipped one toe into the water, testing its temperature, though she knew it would be perfect. Madame Campan had never failed in such details, not once in all their years together. The warmth traveled up her leg like a gentle current, and she allowed herself to sink slowly into the water, inch by careful inch. The rose petals parted around her, creating small eddies that caught the light and sent ripples across the surface. The water embraced her completely, supporting her weight with an effortless grace that seemed almost maternal in its tenderness. She closed her eyes and let her head fall back against the curved edge of the tub, feeling the last of the day's tensions dissolve into the heated water. The scent of lavender seemed to intensify in the humid air, mixing with the subtle fragrance of the rose petals to create an atmosphere that was both luxurious and deeply comforting. This was her sanctuary, the one place where she could exist simply as herself, without the weight of expectation or the burden of representation. Yet, even as she surrendered to the bath's embrace, she found herself acutely aware of its impermanence. Not just this particular evening, but the entire structure of life that made such moments possible. The servants who heated the water, the craftsmen who had carved the marble, the gardeners who tended the roses, the complex web of labor and loyalty that sustained her world, all of it suddenly seemed as fragile as the steam that rose around her. The realization did not bring sadness, as she might have expected, but rather a profound appreciation for the present moment. The water against her skin, the candlelight dancing across the mirrors, the quiet presence of Madame Campan arranging fresh towels. These simple pleasures acquired an almost sacred quality when viewed through the lens of their potential loss. She opened her eyes and gazed up at the ceiling, where painted cherubs cavorted among gilded clouds. The artistry was exquisite, every detail rendered with the skill that had made Versailles a wonder of the world. But tonight she found herself thinking not of the artist's technical mastery, but of the human hands that had held the brush, the eyes that had envisioned beauty and worked to make it real. How many people had contributed to this single room, this single moment of peace? The water lapped gently against her shoulders as she shifted position, sending fresh waves of warmth through her body. She reached for one of the floating rose petals, lifting it from the water to examine its perfect form. The petal was soft between her fingers, its color deep and rich, its edges beginning to curl slightly from the heat. In a few hours it would wilt completely, but now it was beautiful, and that beauty was enough. Madame Campan approached with a crystal bottle of oil, its contents gleaming amber in the candlelight. The ritual of adding the oil to the bathwater was one they had performed so many times that words were unnecessary. Marie Antoinette simply nodded, and Madame Campan poured a small measure into the water, where it spread in iridescent patterns across the surface. The oil carried with it a new layer of fragrance, something deeper and more complex than the lavender and roses. It spoke of distant places and careful preparation, of traditions that stretched back through generations of queens and empresses who had sought comfort in such rituals. She was part of that continuity, a link in a chain that connected her to women she had never met, but whose experiences she somehow shared. As the oil dispersed through the water, she felt its effects on her skin, a subtle softening that seemed to reach beyond the merely physical. The warmth penetrated deeper, carrying with it a sense of renewal that she had not expected. Perhaps this was what she had been seeking without knowing it, not escape from her circumstances, but a deeper acceptance of them, a way of finding peace within the constraints of her position. The clock in the distant hallway chimed the hour, its sound muffled by the chamber's thick walls, but still audible enough to mark the passage of time. How many such chimes had she heard from this very spot? How many evenings had she spent in this warm embrace, letting the water wash away the complexities of royal life? The number was impossible to calculate, but each occasion had been unique, carrying its own particular weight of joy or sorrow, hope or fear. Tonight felt different from all the others, though she could not have said precisely why. Perhaps it was simply that she was paying attention in a way she had not before, noticing details that had always been present, but which her distracted mind had failed to register. The way the steam created tiny droplets on the mirror's surface, the gentle sound of water displaced by her movements, the play of light and shadow across the chamber's walls. She sank deeper into the water, letting it rise to her chin, feeling completely held and supported. In this position, with only her head above the surface, she could imagine herself floating in some primordial sea, connected to forces far older and more enduring than the political turmoil that seemed to surround the palace. The water was her element tonight, offering not just cleansing, but a kind of rebirth, a return to something essential and pure. The rose petals continued their slow dance across the surface, some clustering near her shoulders, others drifting toward the far end of the tub. Their movement seemed random, yet somehow purposeful, as though they were following currents invisible to her eye, but perfectly comprehensible to their own nature. She envied them their simplicity, their ability to exist fully in each moment without the burden of memory or anticipation. Yet as she watched them, she realized that her own situation was not so different. She too was floating, carried by forces beyond her complete control, responding to currents that had been set in motion long before her birth. The difference was that she had been given the gift of consciousness, the ability to recognize and appreciate the beauty of her circumstances, even as she acknowledged their impermanence. The water began to cool slightly, a change so gradual that she might not have noticed it on another evening. But tonight her senses seemed heightened, attuned to every subtle shift in temperature and texture. The cooling was not unpleasant. It simply marked the natural progression of time, the way all things moved from one state to another in an endless cycle of change and renewal. She remained in the water until the last possible moment, reluctant to break the spell that had settled over the chamber. When she finally rose, water streaming from her body in patterns that caught the candlelight, she felt transformed in ways that went beyond the merely physical. The ritual had worked its ancient magic, offering not escape but deeper engagement, not forgetfulness but a more profound kind of remembering. Madame Campan was waiting with warmed towels, and Marie Antoinette allowed herself to be wrapped in their soft embrace. The transition from water to air, from heat to coolness, from solitude to companionship, was accomplished with the same gentle precision that had marked every aspect of the evening. She was clean, renewed, ready to face whatever the night might bring, carrying with her the memory of perfect peace found in the simplest of human pleasures. The letter rests in her palm like a small bird that has forgotten how to fly. Marie Antoinette turns it slowly, watching how the candlelight catches the familiar script of her mother's hand, each loop and flourish as recognizable as her own heartbeat. The Empress Maria Theresa has written from Vienna again, and the weight of the unopened envelope seems to contain not just words, but years of expectation, disappointment, and love that has never quite known how to express itself without conditions. She does not break the wax seal. Something in the quality of the evening light, the way it falls across the mahogany surface of her writing desk, tells her that this moment requires a different kind of attention. The study wraps around her like a sanctuary she has never properly inhabited, its leather-bound volumes standing in perfect rows, their gilt spines catching and releasing light in gentle waves. Most of these books have never been disturbed, their pages as pristine as the day they were bound, chosen more for the elegance of their appearance than for any words they might contain. But tonight, in the amber glow of beeswax candles, she understands something about the nature of communication that has eluded her for 20 years at Versailles. The letters that arrive for her, the conversations that surround her, the very words spoken in her presence, they have all been addressed to the Queen, never to the woman who might exist beneath that title. Even her mother's correspondence, filled with advice about protocol and politics, about the management of courtiers and the cultivation of influence, speaks to a Marie Antoinette who exists only in the imagination of others. The fire in the marble hearth has settled to glowing embers, casting long shadows that seem to breathe with the rhythm of the night. She places the letter gently on the desk, her fingers tracing its edges with the tenderness one might show a sleeping child. The gesture surprises her with its gentleness, this careful handling of words she may never read. The warmth from the dying fire reaches across the room in waves, carrying with it the faint scent of applewood and the deeper fragrance of wax melting slowly in silver sconces. Outside her windows, Versailles sleeps under a blanket of stars, the vast gardens exhaling the day's warmth into the cool air. The palace around her holds thousands of souls, each dreaming their private dreams, yet she has never felt more alone or, strangely, more at peace with that solitude. The tick of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece marks time with the gentleness of a lullaby, each second a soft note in the symphony of her isolation. The sound has become so familiar that she notices it only when she pays attention, like the beating of her own heart or the whisper of her breath in the quiet room. She thinks of all the mornings she has sat at this same desk, dutifully responding to correspondence that never quite seemed to require her authentic voice. Letters to her sister in Naples, carefully crafted to reveal nothing of substance. Notes to various duchesses, perfectly calibrated to maintain the delicate balance of court relationships. Thank you notes for gifts she neither wanted nor understood, written in a hand that had been trained to embody grace rather than truth. Each letter had been a small performance, a demonstration of proper feeling rather than an expression of genuine emotion, but her mother's letters have always been different, weighted with an intimacy that somehow makes them more difficult to bear. Maria Theresa writes as if she believes that somewhere inside the Queen of France lives the daughter she once knew, the Austrian Archduchess, who could be molded and guided and corrected. The Empress offers advice with the confidence of someone who has never doubted that her words will find their intended recipient. Her letters arrive with the regularity of seasons, each one carrying the same fundamental message, that love and approval remain conditional on proper behavior, on the successful performance of roles that seem to shift with each political wind. Tonight, Marie Antoinette recognizes the profound loneliness of being perpetually misunderstood, not through malice, but through the simple impossibility of being seen clearly through the layers of expectation and ceremony that surround her. Even those who love her most deeply love an idea of who she should be rather than who she is. The recognition brings neither bitterness nor self-pity, but something closer to relief, the peace that comes from finally naming a truth that has lived unnamed for years. The candles flicker slightly, disturbed by some imperceptible current of air, and their light dances across the unopened letter. She imagines her mother in the Hofburg, perhaps sitting at her own desk at this same hour, wondering why her daughter's responses always feel so formal, so carefully empty of genuine feeling. The Empress cannot know that every letter she sends is filtered through the consciousness of a woman who has learned to mistrust her own responses, who has been taught that her natural inclinations are invariably wrong. The distance between Vienna and Versailles has become more than geographical. It is the space between who she was expected to become and who she has actually become. The weight of this recognition settles over her like a familiar shawl, bringing not despair, but a strange kind of relief. She has spent so many years trying to bridge the gap between who she is expected to be and who she might naturally become that she has forgotten there might be peace in simply acknowledging the impossibility of that task. The effort itself has been exhausting. This constant translation of genuine feeling into acceptable expression, this endless performance of emotions she is supposed to feel rather than those she actually experiences. The study seems to approve of her stillness, the books and furniture and carefully arranged objects creating a cocoon of muted luxury that asks nothing of her except that she exist within it. The Persian carpet beneath her feet, woven with patterns that tell stories she will never know, absorbs the sound of her breathing and the gentle settling of her silk gown. The crystal inkwell catches the light like a small pool of captured starlight, and the silver letter opener, which has never been used for its intended purpose, lies beside it like a small sword laid down in surrender. She rises from her chair and moves to the window, drawn by the quality of moonlight falling across the gardens. From this height, the formal parterres spread below her like an enormous carpet, their geometric precision softened by darkness into something almost natural. The fountains continue their eternal conversation with the night air, their voices joining in harmonies that have persisted through dynasties and revolutions, through the rise and fall of empires built on nothing more substantial than the agreement of human beings to believe in their permanence. The moon, nearly full, bathes everything in silver light that transforms the familiar landscape into something magical and strange. She can see the outline of her English garden in the distance, that small rebellion against formal perfection that has brought her more genuine joy than all the elaborate entertainments of court life combined. Even from here, she can almost smell the night-blooming jasmine, almost hear the whisper of wind through the herb garden she tends with her own hands. Returning to her desk, she understands now that the letter will remain unopened, not from fear or defiance, but from a deeper recognition that some communications transcend the need for words. Her mother's love, complicated and conditional as it may be, exists in the very fact of the letter's writing. Her own love, equally complicated, exists in this moment of gentle refusal to transform that love into something that must be performed or demonstrated. The letter becomes a bridge that need not be crossed, a connection that exists in its potential rather than its realization. The clock chimes the quarter hour, its voice barely disturbing the profound quiet that has settled over the room. Marie Antoinette sits in perfect stillness, her hands folded in her lap, the unopened letter resting before her like a small monument to all the words that have never quite reached their intended destination. The candles burn lower, their flames steady in the still air, casting a warm glow that seems to embrace both her and her solitude with equal tenderness. In this silence, she finds something she has never expected to discover in the elaborate chambers of Versailles, the profound peace of being completely alone with herself, accountable to no one, performing for no audience except the gentle shadows and the patient, understanding darkness that surrounds her like a blessing. The night air carries the faint scent of roses from the gardens below, mixing with the warm fragrance of beeswax and the deeper notes of leather and old paper that define this sanctuary she has claimed for herself. The fire settles lower in the grate, its embers glowing like small jewels in the gathering darkness, and she realizes that she has found what she has been seeking without knowing she was seeking it. Not answers or solutions or even understanding, but simply this moment of perfect acceptance of who she is when no one is watching, when no performance is required, when the only audience is the gentle night and her own quietly beating heart. The garden exists in a realm between dream and waking, where moonlight transforms familiar paths into something ethereal and strange. Marie Antoinette moves through her English garden like a spirit visiting the scenes of its former life, her bare feet making no sound on the dew-dampened grass. The formal gardens of Versailles sleep in geometric precision beyond the hedgerow, but here, in this corner of controlled wilderness she has created with her own vision, the night breathes with a different rhythm. She approaches the rose arbor she planted with her own hands 3 summers ago, when the court was scandalized by the sight of their queen kneeling in soil, her silk dress stained with earth and her hands dirty with the honest work of creation. The roses seemed to recognize her presence, their petals soft and cool against her fingertips, releasing their fragrance into the cool air like whispered secrets shared between old friends. Each bloom carries the memory of her attention, of mornings spent training their growth along the wooden framework she designed herself. Night-blooming jasmine releases its perfume in gentle waves, mixing with the green scent of dew-heavy grass and the earthy richness of well-tended soil. She breathes deeply, filling her lungs with air that tastes of growing things and patient seasons, of rain absorbed by roots and sunlight transformed into leaf and flower. This is the scent of life lived according to its own natural laws, unmarked by protocol or ceremony. The fragrance seems to enter her bloodstream directly, carrying with it the peace she has found nowhere else in the elaborate maze of Versailles. A fountain whispers somewhere in the distance, its voice joining the soft rustle of leaves stirred by the gentlest of breezes. The sound draws her forward along a path lined with lavender bushes that brush against her nightgown, leaving their purple fragrance clinging to the white linen. She has walked this path hundreds of times, but tonight, each step feels like a discovery, as if the garden is revealing secrets it has kept hidden during the daylight hours. The stones beneath her feet, chosen for their irregular beauty rather than their uniformity, seem to guide her steps with the wisdom of ancient pathways. She remembers the morning she first conceived of this space, how she stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the endless formal parterres, and felt a sudden, overwhelming hunger for something that grew according to its own desire rather than human design. The court architects had been horrified by her request for an English garden, with its deliberately unstructured paths and its celebration of natural irregularity. Such informality was beneath the dignity of Versailles, they argued, too reminiscent of common country gardens where vegetables grew alongside flowers and utility mattered more than appearance. But she had persisted, driven by an instinct she could not name but could not ignore. Now, moving through the moonlit space she created, she understands that this garden has always been her truest prayer, her most honest expression of faith in something larger than the elaborate choreography of court life. Every plant she chose, every curve of path she designed, every stone she placed with her own hands, these were acts of rebellion disguised as decoration, small revolutions hidden in plain sight. The air carries the coolness of approaching dawn, fresh and clean, while overhead stars pulse with ancient light, bearing witness to this moment of profound recognition. She kneels beside a patch of herbs she tends herself, running her fingers through the silver-green leaves of sage and thyme, plants chosen not for their beauty, but for their usefulness, their ability to heal and nourish and sustain. The leaves release their essential oils at her touch, filling the air around her with scents that speak of kitchens and healing, of the practical magic that transforms simple plants into medicine and flavor. The courtiers who mocked her love of gardening, who whispered about the queen who preferred dirt to diamonds, never understood that these moments, kneeling in soil, coaxing life from seeds, watching seasons turn in their ancient rhythm, have been her most honest prayers. The garden holds her secrets better than any confessor, and in its silence she finds the first true peace she has known in years. Here, surrounded by life she has nurtured with her own hands, she experiences a connection to something fundamental that no amount of ceremony or protocol has ever provided. She thinks of all the criticism that has followed her love of simple pleasures, her preference for muslin over silk, for flowers over jewels, for the company of her children over the elaborate entertainments of the court. Each choice has been interpreted as evidence of her failure to understand her role, her inability to embody the magnificence expected of a Queen of France. The courtiers speak of her Austrian simplicity as if it were a character flaw, a failure to appreciate the sophisticated pleasures that should naturally appeal to someone of her position. But here, surrounded by the living proof of her vision, she recognizes that these preferences have never been failures of understanding, but expressions of a different kind of wisdom. The roses climbing the arbor, the herbs thriving in their carefully prepared beds, the fruit trees heavy with promise, all of these bear witness to her capacity for nurturing, for patient attention to the needs of growing things. This garden represents everything she has learned about the difference between creating beauty and merely displaying wealth. The moon moves behind a cloud, and for a moment the garden exists in perfect darkness, defined only by scent and sound, and the feel of cool air against her skin. In this temporary blindness, she experiences the space as the plants themselves might know it, through root and leaf, through the slow circulation of nutrients and the patient work of photosynthesis, through the ancient conversation between soil and sky that requires no human witness to continue. The darkness brings its own form of sight, revealing the garden as a living system rather than a decorative display. When the moon emerges again, washing the garden in silver light, she sees it as if for the first time. Not as a queen's whim or a costly indulgence, but as a testament to the possibility of creating beauty without ceremony, of nurturing life without audience or applause. The garden exists for its own sake, asking nothing more than the attention she has given it, offering nothing less than this perfect acceptance of her authentic self. Every plant grows according to its own nature, requiring only proper care and the freedom to follow its natural inclinations. She rises slowly, brushing earth from her knees, and continues her wandering through the moonlit paths. Each turn reveals some new detail she has forgotten. The way moonlight catches in the heart of an open peony, the sound water makes as it moves over stones in the small stream she diverted from the main fountains, the particular fragrance of night air moving through an apple tree heavy with fruit. The garden reveals itself to her gradually, like a conversation with an old friend who has much to say, but all the time in the world to say it. A nightingale calls from somewhere deep in the shrubbery, its voice liquid and pure in the still air. The sound seems to come from the heart of the garden itself, as if the space has found its voice and chosen this moment to sing. She pauses, listening to the elaborate melody that seems to contain all the joy and sorrow of the natural world, all the patient hope of seeds planted in dark earth, and the quiet satisfaction of seasons completed according to their ancient design. The stream that winds through the garden catches the moonlight and throws it back in scattered diamonds, each ripple creating new patterns of light and shadow that shift and change with hypnotic beauty. She follows the water's path, remembering the day she convinced the engineers to divert this small portion of the grand waterworks that feed the palace fountains. They had been mystified by her desire for such a modest water feature when she could command cascades and jets that soared 50 feet into the air. But she had wanted something that whispered rather than proclaimed, something that invited contemplation rather than demanded admiration. The water speaks to her now in its gentle voice, telling stories of rain and underground springs, of the long journey from sky to earth, to root to leaf, and back to sky again. She understands that she has created here not just a garden, but a sanctuary where natural processes can unfold without interference, where beauty emerges from the patient interaction of soil and seed, water and light, rather than from human design imposed upon reluctant materials. As she completes her circuit and finds herself back at the garden's entrance, Marie Antoinette understands that she has been walking through the landscape of her own soul, recognizing in the patient growth of flowers and herbs the same quiet persistence that has allowed her to survive 20 years at Versailles while remaining, in some essential way, unchanged by its elaborate corruptions. The garden accepts her as she is, asks nothing more than her honest attention, and in that acceptance she finds the peace that has eluded her in every other corner of her carefully constructed life. The first hint of dawn touches the eastern sky, painting the horizon with the faintest suggestion of rose and gold. Soon the palace will wake, and with it the endless round of ceremonies and obligations that define her days. But for now, in these last precious moments of solitude, she stands in the garden she has created with her own vision and her own hands, surrounded by the gentle proof that it is possible to create something beautiful and true even within the artificial constraints of Versailles. The morning air carries the promise of another day, but also the certainty that this sanctuary will endure, growing and changing according to its own nature, offering its quiet refuge whenever she needs to remember who she is beneath the elaborate costume of queenship. In the pre-dawn darkness of the music room, silence holds the space like a prayer waiting to be spoken. Contemplatively, Marie Antoinette moves toward the harpsichord with the careful grace of someone entering a sacred space, her bare feet making no sound on the polished parquet floor. The instrument waits in the corner like a faithful friend, its polished wood gleaming faintly in the pale rectangle of light where the first hint of dawn touches the horizon. Soft breath. She settles onto the familiar bench, her fingers finding their way to the keys without conscious thought. The harpsichord responds to her touch with the gentle voice she has known since childhood, each note falling into the silence like a drop of water into a still pool, creating ripples of memory and understanding that spread outward into the listening darkness. Wistfully, the melody that emerges is simple, almost childlike, a tune her Austrian governess once hummed while braiding her hair in the mornings before lessons began. She had forgotten she remembered it, this small song that belonged to the time before she became a queen, before she learned that every gesture must be calculated and every word weighed for its political implications. Pause. The music room exists in a cocoon of velvet darkness, broken only by the gradually lightening window and the soft gleam of the instrument beneath her hands. Heavy curtains block most of the outside world, creating an intimacy that allows the simple melody to bloom and fade with perfect clarity. The room's acoustics, designed for far more elaborate performances, embrace each note with the same attention they would give to a full orchestra, allowing no sound to be lost or diminished. Emotionally, she plays without sheet music, without audience, without purpose beyond the pure pleasure of creating something beautiful in the darkness. Each note seems to unlock another memory, the sound of her mother's voice singing lullabies in German, the particular quality of afternoon light in the music room at Schönbrunn, the way her hands felt when they were small enough that reaching an octave required stretching until her fingers ached. Soft realization. This is what she has been searching for without knowing it. This moment of pure expression, unmarked by the need to perform or please or demonstrate accomplishment. The melody continues to unfold beneath her fingers, simple and honest as breathing, requiring no skill beyond the willingness to listen to what wants to be played. Pause. Dust motes dance in the thin shaft of early light, moving to the rhythm of the music like tiny dancers celebrating this moment of authentic creation. She watches them spiral and drift, these microscopic particles of the palace's daily life, and thinks how they move with more freedom than she has ever known, responding only to the invisible currents of air and light that guide their eternal dance. Contemplatively, she remembers her music lessons with Monsieur Kreutzer, how he would correct her posture and adjust her hand position and remind her that music must serve the glory of the court. Every piece she learned was chosen for its appropriateness, its ability to demonstrate the refinement and culture of the French monarchy. Even her private practice sessions were observed by ladies-in-waiting who would report on her progress to those who determined whether she was fulfilling her role adequately. Soft breath. But this morning, in the growing light of dawn, she understands that music, like her garden, like the moments of solitude she has stolen from the elaborate choreography of court life, has always offered her a pathway to something real. Not the performance of culture, but culture itself. Not the demonstration of refinement, but the experience of beauty created for its own sake. Pause. The melody reaches its natural conclusion, the final notes hanging in the air like incense slowly dissipating. She does not immediately begin another piece, but sits in the silence that follows, her hands resting quietly on the keys, feeling the vibration of the last chord still resonating through the instrument's wooden body. Peacefully, in this moment of completion, she recognizes that her life has indeed been a performance, as her critics have always claimed. But she understands now that not all performances are false, that some can contain truth even when they are conscious acts of creation. The difference lies not in the performing, but in the intention behind it, whether one performs to hide or to reveal, to deceive or to communicate something essential about the nature of beauty and meaning. Soft wonder. The harpsichord beneath her hands has never lied to her. When she plays badly, it sounds discordant. When she plays with attention and care, it responds with beauty. This honesty, this direct relationship between effort and result, between intention and outcome, has always been available to her in music, even when it was absent from every other aspect of her life. Pause. The light at the window continues to strengthen, painting the room in shades of rose and gold that remind her of the colors in her garden at sunrise. She begins another melody, this one a simple dance tune she learned as a child, and as her fingers move across the keys, she feels the same satisfaction she experiences when tending her roses, the pleasure of nurturing something beautiful into existence through patient attention and genuine care. Contemplatively, the music flows through the gradually brightening room like water finding its natural course, requiring no effort beyond her willingness to follow where it leads. She plays pieces she has not thought of in years, melodies that seem to arise from some deep well of memory that has been waiting for this moment of solitude to reveal its contents. Fading. As the sun rises fully above the horizon, filling the music room with warm golden light, Marie Antoinette continues to play, her fingers dancing across the keys with the same unconscious grace that guides birds in flight or flowers in their turning toward the sun. Sleepily, in this marriage of memory and music, of solitude and sound, she finds a peace that needs no witness, no applause, no validation beyond the simple fact of its own existence. Peacefully, the music carries her toward the new day like a gentle current, asking nothing more than her willingness to trust its ancient wisdom about the relationship between effort and beauty, between authentic expression and the deep satisfaction that comes from creating something true. The bathing chamber exists in the hushed anticipation of dawn, its marble surfaces painted in shades of rose and gold as the first light filters through tall windows. Marie Antoinette moves through the space with the deliberate grace of someone performing a sacred ritual, each gesture weighted with intention rather than habit. This morning, for the first time in 20 years, she will prepare her own bath. The servants who usually attend this elaborate ceremony sleep in their quarters, unaware that their queen has risen before them to claim this most private of moments for herself. She chooses each element with careful attention, testing the temperature of water heated by fires that have burned through the night, selecting oils from crystal bottles that catch the growing light like captured jewels, folding linen towels that have been warmed by the fire in the corner hearth. Each action feels revolutionary in its simplicity, this direct engagement with the basic human need for cleanliness and comfort. This is not the elaborate ceremony of royal bathing with its attendants and protocols, its careful choreography of service and submission. No ladies-in-waiting hover with fresh linens, no pages stand ready to adjust the water temperature or add more fragrant oils. No one measures the precise amount of lavender essence or tests the softness of towels against their cheek before deeming them suitable for royal skin. The absence of ceremony transforms the space, making it feel larger and more intimate simultaneously. Instead, she performs each task herself, her hands learning the weight of water as she pours it from copper vessels, the texture of sea salt as she measures it into her palm, the particular viscosity of almond oil as it disperses through the warm bath in spirals of golden light. These simple actions, forbidden to her by protocol for 2 decades, feel like acts of revolution disguised as routine. Her hands, so accustomed to being ornamental, discover their capacity for useful work. The marble tub, carved from a single block of stone quarried in Italy, has always seemed more like a monument than a vessel for the simple human need for cleanliness. But this morning, filled by her own hands with water warm to her own preference, scented with oils she has chosen for their particular comfort rather than their cost or rarity, it becomes something entirely different, a sanctuary she has created for herself. The transformation is complete and immediate, as if the tub has been waiting 20 years for this moment of authentic use. Steam rises from the water in gentle spirals, carrying the scent of lavender and rosemary into the warming air. She breathes deeply, recognizing these fragrances from her garden, from the herbs she tends with her own hands. Even here, in this most intimate of spaces, she finds traces of the natural world she loves, the growing things that respond to care without ceremony. The connection between garden and bath chamber seems profound this morning, both spaces dedicated to nurturing and renewal. The fire in the corner hearth crackles softly, its light dancing across the walls in patterns that seem to breathe with life. She has built this fire herself, choosing each log for the way it will burn, the particular quality of warmth it will provide. The flames respond to her attention with the same honesty she has found in her garden and her music, burning brightly when fed properly, settling to comfortable glowing when left to their own rhythm. The fire speaks in its ancient language of comfort and safety, of human ingenuity applied to the basic need for warmth. As she slips into the warm water, she feels the weight of the day, the year, the lifetime of performance beginning to dissolve. The water holds her gently, asking nothing more than that she allow it to support her, to warm her, to provide the simple comfort that water has offered to human bodies since the beginning of time. For the first time in memory, she is simply a woman in a bath, belonging entirely to herself. The sensation is so foreign that it takes several moments for her to recognize it as peace. Water laps gently against the sides of the marble tub, creating a rhythm as soothing as a heartbeat. She closes her eyes and listens to this sound, recognizing in it something fundamental about the nature of comfort, how it arises not from luxury, but from attention, not from cost, but from care, not from the service of others, but from the simple act of tending to one's own needs with gentleness. The sound becomes a meditation, a prayer offered to the body that has carried her through 20 years of elaborate performance. She thinks of all the baths she has taken in this chamber, each one an elaborate production involving dozens of servants, precise measurements of temperature and fragrance, careful attention to every detail except the one that matters most, her own experience of the water, the oils, the warmth against her skin. Those baths were performed for the idea of cleanliness, for the maintenance of royal dignity, for the demonstration of proper self-care, rather than for the actual comfort of her body. They had been theatrical events in which she played the role of someone being cared for while never actually experiencing care. But this morning, surrounded by water she has prepared with her own hands, scented with oils she has chosen for their particular ability to soothe rather than impress, she experiences bathing as it was meant to be experienced, as a form of prayer offered to the body that carries her through each day, as an act of gratitude for the simple miracle of warm water and the human capacity for comfort. The difference is profound and immediate, transforming a routine into a revelation. The room feels sacred in its simplicity, transformed by intention and mindfulness into a space of profound peace. The elaborate fixtures and costly materials fade into background, becoming merely the setting for something far more valuable, this moment of complete presence, of attention paid to the most basic human need for cleanliness and comfort. She understands now that luxury has nothing to do with cost and everything to do with the quality of attention brought to simple pleasures. She reaches for a cloth made of the finest linen, but instead of using it immediately, she holds it for a moment, feeling its texture against her palm, appreciating the work of the hands that wove it, the care that went into its creation. Everything in this chamber has been made by human hands for human comfort, and this morning she experiences that comfort directly, without the filter of ceremony or the distance created by service. The cloth becomes not just a tool, but a connection to the anonymous craftspeople who created it with skill and patience. The water continues to hold her with perfect acceptance, asking no questions about her worthiness, making no demands for performance or demonstration of proper gratitude. It simply offers what water has always offered: warmth, support, the gentle dissolution of the day's accumulation of tension and worry. She marvels at this simplicity, this fundamental generosity that requires no protocol, no ceremony, no elaborate preparation beyond the basic human understanding of comfort. The light from the windows grows stronger, painting the chamber in shades of gold and amber that seem to emanate warmth even beyond what the fire and water provide. She watches dust motes dance in the slanted beams, tiny particles caught in their own elaborate ballet, and realizes that she is witnessing the same natural beauty that fills her garden, life expressing itself according to its own laws, creating patterns of movement and light that no human choreographer could design or improve upon. The oils she has added to the water continue their slow work of softening and soothing, their fragrances rising with the steam to create an atmosphere that seems to embrace not just her body, but her entire being. She has chosen each scent for its particular comfort: lavender for its calming properties, rosemary for its ability to clarify thought, almond oil for the way it makes skin feel loved and cared for. These are not the exotic fragrances demanded by royal protocol, but simple, honest scents that speak to the body's own wisdom about what it needs. As she settles deeper into the bath, Marie Antoinette understands that she has transformed this routine act into something profound, not through elaborate ritual or costly additions, but through the simple act of claiming ownership of her own experience. The transformation required no special knowledge or expensive ingredients, only the revolutionary decision to tend to her own needs with the same attention and care she brings to her garden, her music, her children. The water whispers against the marble sides of the tub, a sound as constant and comforting as her own heartbeat, carrying her toward a peace she has never expected to find in the elaborate chambers of Versailles. In this moment of perfect solitude, surrounded by warmth she has created for herself, she finds the deepest luxury of all: the freedom to exist without performance, without audience, without any purpose beyond the simple fact of being alive and present in her own skin. The morning light continues to strengthen, promising another day of elaborate ceremony, but for now, she floats in water that asks nothing of her except that she allow herself to be held, to be warmed, to be gently cleansed of everything that is not essential to the quiet miracle of being human. The light came slowly, as all true things do, beginning as a whisper of pearl against the eastern windows, before gathering courage to become something more substantial. Gently, Marie Antoinette lay in her bed, her body finally still after the long night's journey through memory and understanding, watching as the dawn painted her chamber in shades of gold and amber that seemed to hold within them all the warmth the world had ever known. Soft morning breeze. The silk curtains moved like living things in the gentle air that drifted through the partially opened windows, carrying with it the scent of roses from the gardens below, and something else, something indefinable that spoke of new beginnings and quiet acceptances. She had not slept, not in the conventional sense, but she felt more rested than she had in years, as if some deep part of her had finally been allowed to lay down a burden she had not even known she was carrying. Peacefully. The room around her seemed transformed by the morning light, each familiar object touched with a kind of sacred presence that made her understand why the ancients had worshipped the sun. Her dressing table, with its collection of silver brushes and crystal bottles, gleamed like an altar. The portrait of her mother, which had watched over her through so many nights of uncertainty, seemed to smile with a new kind of approval, as if Maria Theresa could see from her painted eyes the woman her daughter had finally become. Birds singing. From the gardens came the sound of awakening life, the liquid notes of nightingales giving way to the more cheerful chorus of larks and finches, their voices weaving together in a symphony that spoke of continuity and renewal. Marie Antoinette listened to them with the attention she had never given to any court musician, understanding that this music had been playing long before she was born and would continue long after she was gone, and finding in that thought not sadness but a profound comfort, whispered. She thought of her children, still sleeping in their nursery, their faces soft with dreams that she hoped were filled with light and laughter. Whatever came, she would face it, knowing that she had given them love, that in the hours before dawn she had found within herself a strength and clarity that would allow her to be the mother they deserved, the woman she had always been beneath the layers of expectation and performance. Contemplatively, the dust motes danced in the sunbeams that slanted through the windows, each tiny particle caught in its own small orbit of light, and she watched them with the fascination of someone seeing such things for the first time. How many mornings had she missed this simple miracle, too caught up in the elaborate choreography of court life to notice the way light could transform even the smallest, most insignificant things into something beautiful. Pause. Gentle realization. She understood now that this was what she had been searching for without knowing it, this sense of being complete exactly as she was, without need of validation from ministers or courtiers, or even her beloved husband. The woman who had woken before dawn, feeling restless and uncertain, had discovered in the hours since then that she contained within herself everything she had ever needed. Softly, the future stretched before her, unknown and perhaps challenging, but she felt no fear of it now. Whatever storms might come, she had found her center, that still point within herself that could not be disturbed by external circumstances. She was Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, but more than that, she was simply Marie, a woman who had learned to love herself with the same generosity she had always shown to others. Morning bells. From the chapel came the sound of the first bell calling the faithful to morning prayers, its bronze voice rolling across the palace grounds with a resonance that seemed to echo in her very bones. She did not rise to dress for Mass, as protocol demanded, but remained in her bed, understanding that her prayers had already been answered in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. Peaceful breathing. The light continued to strengthen, painting the walls of her chamber in warm gold that reminded her of the wheat fields she had seen from her carriage windows during summer journeys to Compiègne. She had always loved those fields, the way they moved like water in the wind, the promise they held of harvest and abundance. Now she understood that she too had been growing toward some kind of harvest, and this morning was the moment of its gathering. Tender. Her hand moved to rest over her heart, feeling the steady rhythm that had carried her through 37 years of life, through triumph and disappointment, through the intoxicating early days of her marriage and the more complex years that had followed. Each beat was a small miracle, a gift that required no justification or explanation, and she marveled that she had taken such wonders for granted for so long. Distant sound of palace awakening. From beyond her chamber came the soft sounds of the palace beginning its daily routine, the whispered conversations of servants, the gentle closing of doors, the almost inaudible rustle of silk as ladies in waiting prepared for another day of ceremony and obligation. But these sounds seemed to come from another world, one that she was connected to, but no longer defined by. Serene. She thought of Louis, probably already at his desk reviewing papers and correspondence, his brow furrowed with the weight of kingship. She would go to him soon, would offer him the gift of her newfound peace, would let him see that the woman he had married was still there beneath all the accumulated expectations, perhaps more herself than she had ever been. Gentle wind. The breeze stirred the curtains again, and she caught a glimpse of the gardens below, where gardeners were already at work among the flower beds, their movements unhurried and purposeful. She envied them their simple tasks, the way they could pour their attention into the immediate needs of growing things, and she understood that she too had been tending something all these years, though she had not recognized it at the time. Contemplative pause. What she had been cultivating was herself, the essential self that existed independent of titles and roles and the endless performance of royal life. That self had been there all along, waiting patiently through all the years of uncertainty and self-doubt, ready to emerge when she finally had the courage to look for it. Soft realization. The irony was not lost on her that this moment of perfect peace had come to her in a palace, surrounded by all the luxury and ceremony that she had once thought defined her worth. But now she understood that the palace was simply the setting, not the story itself. The story was the journey of a young woman who had traveled from Austria to France and discovered that home was not a place, but a state of being, a way of existing in the world with grace and authenticity. Warm morning light. The sun had fully risen now, flooding her chamber with light so pure and golden that it seemed to transform everything it touched into something precious. The familiar furniture, the silk wallpaper, even the porcelain figurines on her mantelpiece seemed to glow with an inner radiance that spoke of blessing and benediction. Peaceful. She closed her eyes and felt the warmth of the sunlight on her face, understanding that this moment was hers to keep regardless of what the future might bring. No revolution could take from her this sense of completeness. No political upheaval could disturb the peace she had found in the simple act of accepting herself exactly as she was. Birds continuing their song. The morning chorus had reached its full glory now, a celebration of life and renewal that seemed to echo the joy she felt in her own heart. She was enough, had always been enough, would always be enough. The woman who had spent so many years seeking approval from others had finally found the only approval that truly mattered. Sleepily, as the golden light continued to pour through her windows, Marie Antoinette felt herself settling deeper into the perfect peace she had discovered, understanding that some gifts come only to those who have the patience to wait for them in stillness. Gentle exhale. The last bath had cleansed more than her body. It had washed away everything that was not essential, leaving only the pure gold of her truest self. Fading. In that understanding, she found a rest more profound than sleep, whispered a peace that would carry her gently through whatever dawn might bring. Eternal morning silence. Join us for more quiet moments from history where literary storytelling meets peaceful sleep. Subscribe for stories that honor both the art of narrative and the gift of rest.